Greetings all, welcome to Q&A 19 where I get to answer questions that you guys send in. Priority as ever is given to the questions submitted by appropriate patrons, but I do take the occasional question from the field as it were, such as YouTube comments, Facebook messages and so on. So 3 observations to start with going back. Firstly, thank you to those people who wish to point out that rabbits are lagomorphs and not rodents. I appreciate the scientific accuracy, but really, go get yourselves an education. Apparently, you are not familiar with Tim. Secondly, I have been surprised by the comments about my use of the contraction ament. I have been informed that it's generally a British thing, and that for whatever reason, Americans, because of their accent or general pronunciation systems or something, generally can't say it. So it's something of an unheard of thing on this side of the Atlantic. I was not aware of this. I am now. However, I assure you that it is a valid contraction, in as much as such contractions are valid in the first place. I have been informed, again as a response to Q&A 18, that a Polish armoured train engaged in direct combat against a Panzer unit, and at least one Russian one, and also a German armoured train was engaged by French TDs. Details for this are on the comments section for the previous Q&A 18 video. Finally, as a complete and total aside, you may be familiar with one of the cameramen I worked with over at World of Tanks, Mike Lovin. He does a cameo in the battle reporting from an airfield video if you haven't seen it. After he and Wargaming went their separate ways, he went and made a movie named Murder Bury Win about a bunch of gamers stuck with a body. Reviews from the indie scene have been good enough that it got picked up for distribution, so it's currently available for pre-order on iTunes or Apple TV, if you want to know, as an example, where you can go on in life after hanging around with me for a bit. And now, on with the questions, starting with Striker 1959. After the fall of France, surviving FTs were taken for internal security duties. What did that entail? Also, what happened to the ones still floating around when the Allies landed in Europe? Nothing overly exciting, I'm afraid. When World War II kicked off, the French army officially had 2,850 FTs on strength, but in reality 1,445 were in active use, and another 1,093 were unarmed because their guns had been removed for installation into their Rhino and Hotchkiss replacements. Sometimes a random machine gun would be found and mounted as best possible to fill in the gap. Of these, the Germans officially captured 1,704 vehicles. They would be used for airfield security, mounted on flat cars for rail car duty on track protection trains, used in anti-partisan operations, although I can't imagine them being particularly useful there, and I seem to recall reading somewhere that about 400 were given to the Vichy for use in North Africa, but they were stored in German-controlled motor pools. A number were used against the Americans and British in Torch. More FTs were sent to other rear area locations, like the Balkans or Scandinavia. The only German combat unit I can find which had FTs on strength in France in 1944 was the 100th Panzerabteilung attached to 91st Division. The unit was all captured French vehicles with a strength of 8 Hotchkiss 38s, 14 Rhino R35s, a Samoa, a B-1 Flampanzer, and 5 FTs. I don't know what happened to them, but I suspect nothing good. About 100 were also converted into bunkers, often just the turrets. Alexander H. Can I elaborate on the 1961 Checkpoint Charlie incident? Well, the first thing to remember is that this was pretty soon after the Berlin Wall went up. That happened in the middle of August 1961, so the standoff was barely 2 months later in October. So there's definitely a period of heightened tension here. For whatever reason, the Soviet and East German governments decided to start making noises about closing off Berlin again, as they did in 1948 to cause the Berlin airlift, except this time they even started to comment about the airlift option. Military forces running the corridor from Checkpoint Alpha at the edge of West Germany and Checkpoint Bravo at the entry point to West Berlin also started getting harassed, to the point that the US started to protect transiting forces with M48 tanks, which is why they were able to be used in Berlin. The US Chief of Mission to West Berlin, think of it a bit like an ambassador, wanted to go to a theater in East Berlin on the 22nd of October. Despite his license plates, East German police stopped him at Checkpoint Charlie. At this point, General Lucius Clay decided he was going to make a point. He gave instructions that the next time a diplomatic or forces car was stopped by East German police, contrary to agreements, the US military would escort the car through. And then he sent some poor volunteer from the diplomatic mission through to see what would happen. Sure enough, the East Germans stopped the car on the way back from East Germany, but this time MPs crossed the border in order to bring the diplomat back. The East Germans were somewhat taken aback by this. Harassment may have been part of their instructions, but it was doubtful that they felt inclined to escalate on their own to conflict. The next day, the 24th, 26 vehicles were stopped by East German police, and 26 times military personnel crossed the border to bring the vehicles back west. This continued on until the 27th. By this point, Clay had decided that things might get a little bit more tense, so he sent an armoured company of 10 M48A1s and 3 M59 APCs to stage nearby. This was observed by the Russians, who then sent a tank battalion of their own to stage over at the Brandenburg Gate. After the next crossing by the volunteered diplomat was concluded, the US tanks were ordered back, but in the intervening time, 10 of the 33 Soviet tanks went on to the checkpoint. The US tanks then turned back and the face-off commenced. After about 16 hours, an agreement was reached at the presidential level that this was all getting a bit silly and not worth starting World War III over. In return for a commitment that the Allies weren't going to force East Berlin, the Soviet tanks made the first move. One reversed 5 meters. Then an American tank did the same. And so on until finally they all went away. Josh Conti. If T-29, T-34, T-30 or T-32 had been available in small quantities for deployment to Europe in the final months of World War II, would they have been the most powerful vehicles on the battlefield, and would they have made any serious contributions to the war effort? Would they have had a good service life had they entered production? To answer the first question, only if the other tanks had not also magically become available in small quantities like E-100 or IS-3. But no, I can't imagine that it made much practical difference. By the final months, fortifications like the West Wall were no longer much of a thing, and there wasn't much by way of armoured opposition. The chances of one of these heavies being in the same place as anything that the Germans had which would require them, like a King Tiger or Jagdtiger, were pretty small. And even at that, the US generally did figure out how to deal with them even without their own heavies. The only tank of that collection which might possibly have had a good service life would have been T-32, which I've talked over before, because it had a fair bit of Pershing and patent commonality for parts, and also it provided the most powerful and flexible gun on a US tank, at least until the arrival of M103 in 1957, in the absence of anything heavier, bigger, or the T-29 series tanks. Also, the test results for T-32 were pretty good. Again, I've mentioned this before in previous Q&As. Admiral Tiberius, where do I think the beginnings of various myths regarding the Shermans started, during the war or afterwards? Am I still finding entrenched diehards as I go about my holy work? Certainly it happened during the war. It hit national papers around the winter of 1944-45 and became something of a scandal. It's interesting to note the timing. The worst country for tank engagements would probably have been Italy, where options for maneuver were slim, yet it wasn't until after the invasion of France that things started to receive their reputations. It was certainly enough of a topic of discussion for then Lieutenant Colonel Erdzik to be writing his piece in 1946 as to how people just didn't understand what made the Sherman tank so good compared to its German opponents. I'll put a link to his piece in the video description, but it shows you just how far back this argument goes. As with any myth, there is obviously a grain of truth. The German tanks did have, as we all know, generally more armour and a bigger gun. A US crewman doesn't care about all the various things which worked in his favour to get to the point that he's now facing a big German tank, and no soldier wants even a fair fight, let alone where he feels like he's at a disadvantage. However, much like today, there is a level of bias in the sampling being conducted, so no change there. These things generally entrenched a bit at that point, and then were reinforced by pop culture. In the movies and comic books in the 60s and 70s, it was convenient to show the hero up against overwhelming odds. It made a good story, and besides, why would anybody bother to question it? Look, Kelly, a tiger has only one weak point. That's its ass. You've got to hit it point blank, and you've got to hit it from behind. Of course, the reality is no, not with that 76. And yes, there are still plenty of unbelievers who need to be cleansed of their misguidance. They comment frequently enough on my YouTube videos. Thunderchild, what was special about the M113 which made it so successful when the M114, Sheridan, the early Bradley and other similar aluminum-based vehicles were such failures? Also, any comments on the M548? The big problem with the M114 was the physical shape of the thing. The nose juts out well in front of the tracks. So if you go down into a ditch, you're going to dig into it and get stuck. I have no idea how this got past the QA process. The idea of ditching oneself was identified long before World War II. Look at all the unditching rollers on the front of half-tracks and scout cars. The Sheridan's problem wasn't so much with the construction as with the expense and fire control system. Yeah, there's all sorts of comments about how the thin aluminum and skin was a vulnerability, but face it, it's an airmobile tank, and if it were made of steel, it wouldn't be particularly any more survivable. Similarly, as long as the Bradley was to swim, aluminium made sense. Once they decided swimming was no longer a concern, they put additional steel armor on it. So it's more a matter that the requirements for M113 could be fully met, and not so with the other vehicles. As for why M113 was so good fundamentally, well, it was simple, easy to maintain, didn't bog itself in, was cheap, and quite frankly could do pretty much anything. I have not heard anything negative about the M548 outside of it having been rendered obsolete by the arrival of more capable off-road trucks. Certainly I found the vehicle to be very simple to drive. Also, Thunderchild, if the 17-pounder was so poor fitting in Firefly, how bad was the 105 Sherman that Israel developed? Not only Israel, the Argentinians had their own version as well. I have not been inside either, so I can't tell you for sure. But the first thing to note is that they did get an extra few inches because of the stretched turret front of the 76. And secondly, it could afford to lose a few meters per second for firing heat rounds. Combined with an absolutely bloody massive muzzle brake, the recoil stroke was kept within the turret ring. However, even so, these would not have been small rounds, and I can't imagine there was ever a massive rate of fire for the thing. It was really more a case of anything vaguely viable being better than nothing. Wraith de Cadmus. What's the longest I've ever spent buttoned up? Was there anything that got on my nerves that I didn't expect? Honestly, not more than an hour or so that I can recall, and it was in a sniper-prone part of Mosul. No nerves, other than the typical nerves caused by, I'm in a 65-ton stationary target and I can't see much. I found the driver's position in tank school to be more claustrophobic / disconcerting, but not anything you didn't get distracted from once you started going. I never did any of those like 24-hour chemical attack drills. Grim, you are the senior military procurement official for the Caribbean island of Tropico, maybe about 3/4 the size of Cuba. Now, to my shame, I've never actually played it. One day, maybe. It's the late 60s to early 70s. El Presidente wants to have the most powerful land force in the region. Anything you can think of would make the tropical army look suitably modern and powerful. Money isn't a concern. And he then lists off a series of vehicle categories. The first question is, if it's an island, surely a good navy is more important. But of course, if one looks at the history of Cuba, you'll see how they did get involved in a few expeditionary conflicts. The operative detail in this question, I think, seems to be to look suitably modern and powerful. That means that what can be run on parade and make it look like the country is doing well, instill national pride in the people and loyalty to their faith in El Presidente. It doesn't mean suitable for actual use in combat. So for a tank, I'd go with the AMX-30. Very new, sleek design, only just entered full-scale production in France. Big cannon, made to look bigger by the thermal sleeve. Big 20mm coaxial, has a massive cupola, so the TC can look very imposing standing at the top of it. It also has a vaguely practical use and won't be quite as destructive to Tropico's banana wood bridges as, say, Chieftains would be. Get some M103s off the Americans, maybe a dozen. Just enough to fill out a section in the parade and a couple of M51 ARVs to follow. Again, only 2. For actual daily work, I mean, that's not completely hobble the army doing this parade business, the main ARV, probably the AMX-30D. For similar reasons, a bunch of Jeeps with big, imposing AT2 swatters on the back will look great as TDs, whilst not being utterly useless. For the light tank, SK-105. Yeah, I know it's really more of a TD, but we're labeling it a light tank for the parade. It's lighter than a normal tank after all, and the big oscillating turret with a large gun does look awfully impressive. For scout cars, the V150 with the 90mm also seems suitably impressive. An AA gun, I think, has to be a ZSU-23-4, and the SA-4 GANF can come alongside. The thing is definitely impressive on display, as are Scuds. For an APC, see if the Americans will sell the 6 M44s. If not, BMPs are suitably sleek and dangerous looking. For SP artillery, surely the M107 with the massive gun, as well as a few M110s along to be actually more useful. There is also apparently something in the Banana Republic psyche which mandates that there be people standing in the backs of Jeeps with pintle-mounted GPMGs. Caleb Engelhardt, I've heard rumors of some tanks with Christie suspension having return rollers. Is this true? Comet would like to have a word with you. Why did Centurion use horsemen via torsion bar? Well, mainly they wanted to preserve all the interior space. Torsion bars may take up a lot less space in some systems, but they still knock off a good few inches from the bottom. Bogies can be entirely external, and of course they're easy to swap out. A wild atom appears. Did I name my tanks? What were they? My first tank was barely legal, and it was already named by my crew when I got to it. I thought it was a good name and certainly not worth pulling rank over with the resulting negative impression on my own crew. The second tank, my choice was Diplomatic Incident. Then I went off to Bradley's, and as the CEO of Outlaw Troop, I instructed that the new vehicles we got be given outlaw names. So normally what you do in the US Army is you pick a name with the same letter as the troop or company. So, Alpha Company gets all A letter names, but whatever. I went with Outlaws because Outlaw Troop. So things like Darth Vader, Dillinger, pick a bad guy. Part of the new equipment training evolution was a gunnery exercise, which kept me, the CEO, quite busy, and this gave the Bradley its name. Sleep deprivation. I know of a photo around somewhere, but bugger if I can find it. Alex Gallagher. If I had to own a tank from the 1950s, which one would I buy? If I had to? What sort of dystopian/utopian scenario are we contemplating here, where I have to own a tank from the 1950s? Well, probably an M48. Simple to drive, rubber track so I can have it on the highway without much problem, and most importantly, I know I fit well in it. Adam Schindler. How does the commander of an armor or cavalry commander grasp the situation of his unit, seeing as it's hard enough to have situational awareness for one armored vehicle, let alone 6? Well, actually 14 for a tank company. It's actually probably easier than knowing where your own tank is, because you have a map, a radio, and people calling grids over the radio. You look at the map and you know where they are. There's no requirement for the company to remain within line of sight of the CEO for him to personally keep track of it. That said, of course, that wasn't historically the case. In times where only the company commander's tank had a radio for communication with a battalion or a supporting unit, for example, the CEO didn't normally need to worry himself about it anyway. It was the responsibility of the other tanks to maintain their position information off the CEO. Even if the CEO noticed that there was a tank out of position, there wasn't a whole hell of a lot he could do about it anyway. It's a case in point that I give about how Bilot's run showed the massive failings of the Char B1. The man was a company commander, but he entered Stone without his company. The Slavin. If my nickname is the Chieftain, what are the young one and the Mrs. nicknames? Well, Household 6, which is the US equivalent of Domestic Sunray or Domestic GOC, is addressed as wife, as evidenced in some videos, or Spose, from the Spanish esposa, because she's Puerto Rican. Actually, she's Jersey Rican, but she doesn't seem to like the description. She doesn't have a handle per se. Similarly, my son also has no handle. He is referred to as the Sposling. As for your name, looks like Slavin to me. Doing some digging, it comes from Slavin, apparently derived from Sliev, which translates as mountain. Of course, that doesn't mean that your pronunciation has been modified over the years. So for example, almost no Americans pronounce Moran correctly. They will say Moran. Seems to be something about American pronunciation, to unnecessarily pronounce second syllables of two. I mean, garage is my favorite, which I don't understand. I mean, why do you say garage, but not that you're, going to take out the garbage? Don't get it. Centurion 4007. Did Western Allies trial the Centurion after the war, and if so, what were the impressions? Certainly the US did. They received a Centurion 2 with a 17-pounder and a Centurion 3 with a 20-pounder by 1948 for testing in the US, complete with crews. They found that the 20-pounder was prone to fast wear, the muzzle blast was excessive to the point that spotting fall of shot was particularly difficult. The tank wasn't particularly difficult to maintain, and crews felt loading was easier in a Centurion than an M26, even with the bigger 20-pounder round. Fumes were less. Manual traverse sucked. Power traverse worked fine, if a little bit tiring to hold down the palm switch. Manual elevation was fine. The commander's handle was great. Power elevation seemed good. They very much liked the design of the gunner's periscope used in combination with the range drum, though the reticle left something to be desired, as did the quality control of the build. Access to the gunner's seat was a little bit annoying, with the smoke launcher buttons proving a hazard to his head, but, quote, the commander's position in the Centurion is exceptionally well planned and arranged, in contrast to that of M26. Overall American conclusions: penetration, firing armor-piercing discarding saber is substantially as rated, and the gun is superior in this respect to the 90mm tank gun M3 firing shot HVAP-T. Dispersion, firing armor-piercing discarding saber when high explosive is, by accepted standards, slightly greater than that of the 90mm tank gun M3, but that this dispersion is not so great as to impair the effectiveness of the 20-pounder against armored and unarmored targets. The relatively short tube life, estimated at 120 rounds, firing armor-piercing shot is not an excessive price to pay for the improved striking power. The gun controls provided in the Centurion 3 are generally superior to those in the medium tank M26, exceptions being the manual traversing mechanism and the present lack of an emergency firing gear for the main armament. The fire control equipment in the Centurion 3 represents a practical solution to a pressing need and is superior to that in the medium tank M26. The comparatively short time of flight and the flat trajectory achieved with armor-piercing discarding sabot offer substantial advantages, respecting deflection errors due to cant, lead required against moving targets, and allowing ranging errors against armored targets, whether moving or stationary. The overall characteristics and features of the fighting compartment of the Centurion 3, including the 74-inch turret ring, balanced gun, and stabilization in azimuth and elevation, result in a far more fightable turret than that of the medium tank M26. The firepower and general fighting efficiency of the Centurion 3 appear to be superior to that of the medium tank M46, judging from projected improvements to be incorporated in the latter tank. Automotively, they raced the thing against an M26 and a T-29. Over the hill course, Centurion completed the 1.5 miles in about 4 minutes 53, M26 in 6:33, and T-29 in 6:43. Which probably says something about the gearing ratios in T-29 that it kept up with the M26. T-29 eventually dropped out on a secondary hill course. It was coming in at almost twice the time of the other two anyway. The Cent again beat the M26, about 4 minutes 50 to 5:36, and was considered to accelerate much more rapidly. On the downside, off-road, Cent was almost identical to M26. On the 3-mile cross-country course, Centurion came in at 11.8 miles per hour average and M26 at 11.7. However, the drivers found Centurion to be far more tiring to drive. Not surprising, given the M26 used a torque converter while Centurion had a standard manual transmission in the Merritt Brown. It also took longer to train a Centurion driver. The track was a lot more sensitive to rock on Centurion, but the tank did far better than the American one on the 60% grade, going up in 1 minute 39 instead of the M26's 2 minutes 32. If there was a failing in the test vehicle, it was reliability. They had to swap the engine out after 460 miles due to a broken cylinder head stud. Then the entire powertrain blew at 561 miles after the brakes failed on the 60% downslope, and testing had to come to a complete stop. The investigation recorded an opinion of faulty manufacture in the factory. Overall conclusions on the automotive test were as follows. A comparison of Centurion 3 and United States development tanks indicates that from an automotive standpoint, the British tank has the following undesirable features. Uses a liquid-cooled engine. Does not employ a torque converter type transmission. The Merritt-Brown gearbox and driver's controls cause excessive driver fatigue. Track life is believed to be insufficient. Horsepower per ton ratio is too low to permit satisfactory performance. Now, to be sure, they're not going around here claiming the M26 was automotively the better tank. They rated the Centurion 3 as automotively superior to M26, but the US was already about to drop the 800 horsepower Continental with an automatic transmission into the M26 to make M46. So they figured that both the 500 horsepower M26 and the 650 horsepower Centurion failed to meet standard. Finally, they did a series of tests specifically on the Metrovic 2-axis stabilization. They considered it far from perfect, being very difficult to maintain if it broke down, although in fairness it didn't break down often, and being of such a nature that it was impossible to incorporate automatic application of super elevation or lead to the gun. They accepted it did do what it was intended to do very well, but they preferred to wait until a suitable domestic stabilization system with all the bells and whistles that the US desired could be completed. That said, in hindsight, it turned out to be waiting a few years. Rob is there one website that lists tanks on display in the US? For monument tanks, I would recommend the Surviving Panzer's website over on the shattuck.fr. I'll put a link down below. Loch Ness Hamster. How do tanks go about refueling in combat? There are 3 official refueling techniques these days, at least for the US. Tailgate, service station, and refuel on the move, or ROM. In tailgate, the refuelers, and the food and anything else which is being supplied, drive up to the tanks, wherever they are, usually in fighting positions, and basically just offload onto the back deck. Supplies basically come to you. In service station, the resupply point is set up with a flow, and normally 2 tanks can be at any point of the station at once. So you drive up to one side of the fuel truck, say another tank will be on the other side of the fuel truck, and you fill up. Then you drive forward a few meters to the food truck, you get food. Then you drive forward a few meters to the ammo truck and get ammo, that sort of thing. Normally tanks will go through this by section or by platoon. This is generally faster than tailgate, but obviously requires that the tanks move off the line, which means that not only does it reduce immediate combat capability, but moving tanks around may also be a bigger signature than the driving trucks to the tanks. Refuel on the move isn't quite an unrep, it's more of a splash and dash designed to keep a unit moving forward. When you fuel up, instead of filling all 3 tanks, which can take quite a while, you are given a predetermined amount of fuel. So you pull up, open the one fuel filler port on the back, get your X many gallons, and as soon as the fueler says done, get back on the move and make room for the next guy. I don't know how other countries do it, but I can't think of many other ways of getting the job done. Actually, can't really think of any other ways of getting the job done. George Paramore. Will the concept of reducing armor for mobility, such as Leopard 1 and MX-30 demonstrated, make a return? For example, if railguns started showing up. I think it depends a lot whether there are similar advances in armor technology commensurate with the advances in railgun technology. I can expect that active protection systems are going to be fielded in greater prevalence, and insofar as the effect against missiles and the like can be dealt with by adding 2 tons of trophy versus 4 tons of roof armor, for example, then it is reasonable to presume that's the direction that they will go. But I can't think of much benefit that a relative increase in tactical mobility would result in. I mean, are you any more likely to be missed by a railgun round because you have a slightly better power to weight ratio? Probably not. Much as, in fairness, I don't think it was ever really shown that you could dodge a heat round because your Leopard 1 was quicker 0 to 30 than an M60. Further, just because somebody puts out a railgun doesn't mean that all of a sudden that there's no point in worrying about the prevalence of 100mm, 125mm, 105mm or missiles. You may not be proof against everything, but you probably have a railgun of your own at that point by which you want to just get onto target faster than the other guys. And the armor would be just for everything else except for a railgun. John Rayburger. Which country has the best development process for tanks and armored vehicles? Why is their development process better? It's difficult to say because each country is going to have its own issues. There probably is something to be said for the Chinese system. They seem to work with the 90% solution and implement it immediately. There are no lawsuits over the bidding process I can think of, and the check and balance to prevent fraud isn't a 5-year oversight process. It's the knowledge that if you get caught, you will be shot. Then just throw manpower at the production. The Type 99 isn't a bad tank. I mean, is it as fantastic as an M1A3? No, probably not, but it's not exactly Stone Age technology either, and it was placed into mass production quickly. The US occasionally does bypass a lot of the administrative rubbish. My favourite was when they looked to see what was that soldiers were buying with their own dollars before going overseas. And the army decided that if the troops felt that these things were that useful that they were spending their own money, maybe the government should be buying it for them. Of course, it's the small stuff like knives, cold weather gear, rifle sights, that sort of thing. I have a friend who works up in DC. He told me once he saw a briefing on the acquisition process for some new vehicle, and at the end of the 40-odd page PowerPoint, it had something akin to desired end state achieved. Vehicle approved for service in full compliance with all regulatory conditions. And it didn't include something like X many vehicles capable of overmatching anything else in the world has been fielded to troops. It was like the goal was the process, not the end result. Frankly, I think we'll be better off accepting a little bit of corruption in order to avoid being behind the adoption curve of new technologies. I mean, look how long it took us to put an active protection system on our vehicles. I cannot speak as to the development processes of other countries with any authority or reliability. The Japanese and Israelis, for example, seem to know what they want and make good examples of it. Whether this is the result of their process or just good luck, I can't tell you. Fred Benton. If I could own one aircraft to fly about, what would it be? Realistically, something like a 182, big enough for the family and affordable to buy. I mean, I wouldn't mind an SR-22, DA-40, a TTX, or an Ovation Ultra, which is built down the road. But have you seen the cost of these things? After I got my medical cert, I guess companies trawled the databases or something, I started getting a new level of junk mail. And we're talking high-gloss embossed mini magazines with hand-signed cover letters. My favourite came from Cirrus and was along the lines of, for a cost of only $3,500 a month, you too could be flying around in the best general aviation aircraft on the market. Only $3,500 a month. My mortgage isn't that high. Yeah, I get that flying isn't a cheap hobby to begin with, but really? In any case, I haven't flown in about 5 years. Something to do with having a family and a mortgage. If you want to laugh, go to the Cirrus website and go to the Vision Jet webpage. It comes complete with a photo of a happy family, 2 kids in the back, one drawing on his iPad, an airplane. Just like it's like from a Chevy Tahoe brochure, except it's in a $2 million private jet. I mean, I guess there are families who can afford it, but the market for such families, complete with a pilot's license, surely can't be that big. The former Irish Air Corps Machete Warriors were brought into the US by a company in California. They were refurbished and put on the open market for something akin to $130,000, which isn't actually bad for an aircraft with that level of performance. Only 2 seats though. Either way, such a luxury is so far in the future, I don't even browse Trade-A-Plane to see what's out there like one might browse car websites when you're daydreaming. And yes, I have considered a home build like a van's, but I have not the time in the day to do it. And finally, I don't care about aerobatics. Not for me. Ian Barlow, after track is fit and tensioned, what happens to it that it loses tension and needs to be retensioned? Well, basically, the track is metal. It bends, stretches, and the joints wear. Andrew Sebastian, was there ever a project called MBT-80? There used to be pictures on the web claiming to be this vehicle, but no 2 pictures showed the same. Most looked like some sort of transition from the M60 to the M1 by way of the MBT-70. Not in the US that I know of. There was a UK program, but the US went from the MBT-70 to the XM803 to the M1 program with a few paper design proposals in between, but none of them were named MBT-80. At most, the US may have been keeping an eye on the British MBT-80 project just to see what was going on. Van Owen. Did Western forces ever stand a real chance of stopping the Soviets before the fall of the Iron Curtain? I think yes. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, I believe the West could have held its own. After all, Lend-Lease would have come to a screeching halt, and given that something like 70% of the explosives the Soviets used in its ammunition were coming from the US, the Soviet war-making ability would have suffered some pretty significant shortfalls. Plus, the West had some pretty mean equipment of its own. That said, there probably was a time in the 1950s before the German army came back into the picture, and while the US was still suffering from Korea, that things would have leaned more in the warpack direction and again in the 1970s. What the Egyptians did to the Israelis in 1973 would have been a cautionary tale of air defense and anti-tank missiles, except that the warpack would probably be better trained, more disciplined, and using even better equipment. And this would have lasted through till about the 1980s. Robert Henry Ilston. Japan's Type 74 has an unusual track setup. What advantages does it have? I'm not sure it seems all that weird to me. I mean, it's an unsupported hydropneumatic type. Why they went unsupported, I couldn't tell you. Hydropneumatic is rare, but not unheard of even for the 1970s. Just look at the S-Tank. At the cost of weight, complexity, and interior volume, the Type 74 is able to nose down some 6 degrees and lean to the side 9 degrees. Remember, Japan is a mountainous country, so the ability to tilt forwards and backwards will increase the arc of fire of the tank. The advantage to tilting side to side is that the tank can operate on a side slope. So don't forget, if you tilt the tank over, cant correction is required to obtain a hit. Otherwise, the round will go off to one side when the gun super elevates for range. A horizontal tank is most accurate, but even a tank with an inbuilt cant correction feature in the fire control system usually has a limit. I think on the M1 it's only go to about 21 to 25 degrees, for which it can compensate. If you can artificially reduce the tank, then the fire control system will in effect have a greater realm of capability. Obviously, it's not a terrible idea in the mountains, and the successor vehicles, Type 90, Type 10, and the Korean K2, Korea also having a few mountains, all have it. Stafford Magnus. In the context of the US's ammunition capacity fixation in World War II, was there ever given any consideration to external ammunition stowage? Don't think so. Firstly, anything stowed on the outside has an excellent chance of unstowing itself. Secondly, ammunition is fragile. Not in the sense of blowing up, but in the sense of getting dented and no longer fitting well into the gun. You mentioned the rotor trailer as an example of external stowage in your written question, but one of the bat failings was that the ammunition will get damaged by being bounced around. Then you have the issues, if it matters, of actually accessing the ammunition. And finally, as you mentioned, there is the possibility of it going boom. So no, they just found ways instead to get the ammo to fit inside the hull. John I. Boland. German tanks developed later in World War II have a reputation for unreliability. Were there potentially more reliable projects that the Germans passed over in pursuit of total overmatch? Or different design decisions which could have been reasonably made, such as a simpler, less armoured Panther? I think the second half hits the nail on the head. If you look at the original design specifications for Panther as a case in point, it was going to have 2 centimeters less armour, but the instructions came down from above to up-armour it. This was done without any operational requirement. It was a, well, that sounds good to me, sort of change from a bunch of amateurs. Maybe neutral steer was a nice to have, but not absolutely required. That sort of thing. But overall, as I said in the past, I don't think the Germans had any choice but to try for a complete overmatch. Less capable vehicles, even if reliable, probably wouldn't have redressed the numerical imbalance. Lorenzo Sciascia, or Sciascia, forgive me, I don't speak Italian. Why did the Italians stick with riveted armour during World War II? Some say it was a deliberate decision because it was cheap and easy. Others say because Italian industry was too underdeveloped to cast or weld tanks in World War II. If the latter is true, does this mean that a minor World War II power such as Australia was industrially more advanced than Italy, as the former managed to produce cast armoured tanks in the former Sentinel? No, it doesn't mean that. Italy, for example, made heavy trucks. Australia did not. What Australia achieved in the casting of Sentinel was unprecedented, but Sentinel was not really an Australian tank. So, if you read Fallen Sentinel by Peter Beale, he provides a transcript of a meeting about tank production in April 41. The gist of it was, well, if we can figure out casting, if the Americans can cast, so can we. However, we have to have an American gearbox design, American engines, American transmissions, because nothing built in Australia can do the job. We even need to import Australian tooling to create the things here. So, 2 quick extracts. If we could ignore everything else and commandeer all the machinery for gearbox and transmission production, we might get somewhere. I do not think this is possible, however, as a large proportion of it is needed for other production which is quite as urgent as tanks. If we commandeer that capacity for tanks, the other production will have to stop. The plain fact is we do not have enough machine tools for gear cutting, and we haven't much chance of getting more. Tanks are a production headache. There is no established industry to lean on. For example, no one commercially produces a gearbox transmitting 400 to 500 horsepower. The gearbox is the chief difficulty. Basically, Australia could not produce Sentinel without subcontracting out to the US or Canada. Italian tanks, for all the flaws, were entirely home built. As for why they remain riveted, I haven't actually looked it up, I haven't seen anything. The French excuse was that the welders were highly skilled, highly paid, so their work was expensive, and in any case they were busy building ships, so France started the war with very few welded vehicles. I don't know how busy Italian shipbuilders were and rail workers were, but it wouldn't be impossible that they too were too busy, and though Italy did have something of a good industrial base in terms of skill, it wasn't a very good one in terms of size. So it could very well have simply been a matter of practicality to stick with riveting. S-face! What are Sherman tanks in the Pacific mostly knocked out by? I believe 47mm guns with mines coming in second. I suspect the biggest overall knocker out of Shermans was actually the environment and the terrain. That said, figures from Okinawa were that 64 tanks had been mined, 111 hit by gunfire, 38 bogged down, of which 25 were subsequently destroyed by the enemy. Also, would German tanks have benefited from a longer development cycle? I don't think so. The only one which truly needed more testing before fielding was Panther. The rest generally either had most of the bugs worked out, which could be worked out before entering service, or, such as Porsche Tiger, were killed off before entering service. Sure, there were a list of modifications during production as feedback came in from the field, but find me any tank from any nation of any sizable production run which didn't. Skylar Hayes, what's with the lack of use of modular armor packages? Only the Japanese seem to be using them to any particular extent, such as on the Type 10 tank or the Type 16 wheeled vehicle. Do I think this variable level of armor is going to take off in the future? Now, to be sure, we're not talking here about modular armor packages as in easy to replace or upgrade, which of course has been a thing for many years, but instead it means a tailored armored package for different levels of protection depending on threat and mobility requirements. For an obvious example, I will go back to the M8 armored gun system, which had 3 different armor package levels to choose from, taking the tank from between 19 to 25 tons, depending on if you wanted to be able to lapse drop the thing out the back of an airplane, fly it to an airfield in a C-130, or forget the C-130 entirely and fly on something bigger. Arguably, armor packages have appeared on the M1 with ARAT tiles or the large composite armor blocks on the nose of Challenger 2. And, they might count as such sort of tailoring as does slat armor. In fact, the idea certainly goes back as far as World War II with the M10's bolt-on armor, which was available in several different thicknesses. Again, though, I think these were more afterthoughts to the original design. I will agree with you that it likely requires that the tank be designed from the ground up to have such packages as interchangeable base levels as opposed to as add-ons. Although I'm not sure I really see a great practical difference between the two, except one looks neater, probably requires the use of a crane, and doesn't increase the overall dimensions of the tank. As long as applique armor is possible and can do the job, the only advantage I can think of to having the entire package removable is for battle damage repair or cheaper upgrades later in life. Nactel Firakese, what is the ball-shaped tank in the intro of the Pentagon Wars at 1 minute 32? It's not a tank, it is the Marmon Harrington Rhino of 1954. An amphibious vehicle, the big hollow hemispherical wheels provided buoyancy. Apparently it went pretty much anywhere. They only ever built one. Tian Sheep, when ordering Asian food, do I prefer fried or white rice? I don't think I have a preference. As long as there's no shrimp in the fried rice, I think I tend to get them more or less equally. By and large, I tend to go with fried rice for Chinese and white rice for Japanese. Devon Ursini, please expand on my involvement with Girls on the Panzer. It was mainly a matter of providing interior photographs. Something that caught my attention to the show was that the tanks were very well drawn, both inside and outside. And for later shows, they wanted to have vehicles that they didn't have interior pictures of. I was able to generally track those down. For the DVD extras for the finale series, I met up with the producer in Bovington, and we had a little walk-around explanation video. I've only seen 2 minutes of it so far on one of the DVDs, but we did spend a couple of days filming, so doubtless there is more to follow. Finally, the Asian office brought me to Uri to attend the Girls in Panzer / Anglerfish Festival, and I got to know more about how to carve up an anglerfish than I ever thought possible. Plus the thing, at least those ones are a lot larger and uglier than I expected. Matthew Lesich, on a physical level, how do tank rounds differ from artillery shells? Oftentimes they won't. For example, the Sherman's gun was just an updated version of a French artillery piece, so the ammunition was pretty much the same. Even the idea of separate bagged propellant to the projectile isn't a defining feature, asks the British. If there is any common difference, it's in the crimping of the round to the casing. Tank rounds come basically sealed. All you can do is load it and fire, maybe fiddle with the fuse. An artillery round, though, you can often separate your projectile from the case and remove propellant bags, depending on how fast you want to send the round at the gun. Because artillery don't always want the round coming out at top speed, depending on terrain, when you want the time to impact. SEO 896. Why was the strategy of US tanks in early World War II to run over the anti-tank gun? Well, think about what the typical tank of the time was armed with, a 37 or a 40mm gun. Not much of a boom, so if you really want to knock out the gun, crushing it is the fastest way of doing so. It was also theorized that the sight of a tank bearing down on the gun crew would cause panic, and the gun crew would abandon the gun before either getting crushed or shooting the incoming tank. As a result, crushing the gun wasn't just a US thing, but it is famous because of the rule change in the Louisiana maneuvers, which meant that tanks could only call a gun killed if it ran over it. Gorodekij, is buying a tank a good investment, purely money-wise? Yes. Is it the best possible investment with your money? I don't know, good question. But if you buy a tank, you can flip it, or just hold on to it for appreciation value. When the British were selling chieftains at the end of their service lives, they were going for about £2,000 a piece. Now, $60,000 is pretty typical. Apparently, former Yugoslav M18s were going for about $40,000 in 1990. Today, $400,000 wouldn't be unheard of, although granted they likely needed a little bit of work to get to that level. So it does seem like they appreciate over time. The catch is getting onto the ladder in the first place. It's a bit like the housing market. Time Bomb 757. Do individual tank crews have flexibility in determining their ammunition loadouts? Covered previously, but generally no. Expect such decisions to be made at higher levels. Bear in mind, ammunition supply for the army as a whole is determined by way higher on the basis of estimates of needs, so when a tank crew resupplies, it's going to be on the basis of what happens to be available in the supply dump. Hopefully the estimates from higher were correct. How do specialized rounds like canister get issued out? No different. I mean, the basic issue of supply is determined by higher. Now, that's not to say a little horse trading can't happen. If one unit has an excess of one type of round which another unit wants, an exchange isn't unheard of. So for example, my tank in Iraq only had one kind of ammo. We were considering swapping a few of our impact rounds out for some heat rounds that the neighbouring platoon from another division had, but we couldn't be arsed to do it in the end. Big boy! Would the US Army be capable of deploying its armoured formations from bases in the US to a conflict overseas in any reasonable amount of time? Does the Navy even have enough sea lift capability to move those forces or protect them during transit? You kind of hit upon a sensitive topic there, which the US has been chewing on for a little while now. Warfare is getting faster, and it will be embarrassing to show up after the fight. Indeed, this is the whole premise, of course, behind the Strike Brigade combat team. It is possible to fly a brigade anywhere in about 2 days. The core of the Army's quick response for heavy forces is the Army Prepositioned Stock program. These are unit sets stored around the world in climate-controlled facilities in places like Europe, Korea, or Qatar, or in the case of APS-3 on ships. The troops don't need to bring any equipment, just themselves and what they wear or carry. They fly to where the equipment is and draw it out from those sites. In the Cold War, they were referred to as Combat Equipment Group sites. Obviously, it still requires a couple of days to get the troops to the equipment and then the equipment issued out, but it's much faster than railheading to a port, loading ships, and then getting across the ocean. During a stress test about 1.5 years ago, the Navy did a snap mobilization of its sea lift fleet to find out what it could do. Of 61 ships, 25 were fully capable. And that was just the ships. Manning them was another kettle of fish entirely. The Navy operates some 19 large medium-speed roll-on roll-off ships, of which 8 are used for pre-positioned stocks and 11 are available for whatever sea lift. Bearing in mind that each ship is capable of carrying a reinforced armoured battalion, it means that in effect the Navy can transport an armoured division at a time, if all their ships are working. Presumably more once the pre-positioned stocks get dropped off and then those ships also become available. Which of course also means that several divisions in the US are stuck there until more shipping space becomes available. So from the word go, a day or two to get a brigade onto an airplane, a day to get to the stocks, 3 or 4 days to actually issue the equipment. In the meantime, it would likely take 3 or 4 days for a unit to be ready for railheading, another day or two to get to the port, and even more time to load the ships, which is fine because it's going to take 4 or 5 days to get the ship ready for sail anyway, calling back all those reservists who man the things. About a week to get across the ocean, and then you have to do all the offloading issuance and so on. So realistically, I can't see the US getting another division fielded in, say, Central Europe or Korea in anything less than 3 weeks to a month. And that still leaves a couple of divisions in the US. I don't think there's any easy way of knocking time off that. The only answer to getting more than a division in a month is either more ships and sailors or larger pre-positioned stocks, both of which cost money. Mr. Doom 12. Are there 11 others? Do I think that the M1A2C could benefit from a 20mm coax and a 130mm or 140mm autoloader, but retain the loader? No. If you're going to do a 20mm, you probably want an external mount, such as on the T-72 M2 Moderna, or maybe the MBT-70's retractable one. It's just not worth taking up the space inside the tank. But really, just because you can do it doesn't mean it's necessarily a great idea. I mean, it's not a horrible idea. But what are you going to shoot at with a 20mm that you're not going to shoot at with either the 120mm, especially with a programmable fused round, or the coax? As to the second part, I think if you're going to upgun to that size a gun and mandate an autoloader, you're going to be as well off simply designing an entirely new tank to begin with. Before the M1A2 program was confirmed back in the 90s, there was a cost-benefit analysis conducted, with one of the other options being the creation of a new turret and a bigger gun, an autoloader. And we're not talking thumper, we're talking this is more purpose designed, as it were, and if I recall correctly, to be made of titanium. The conclusion was that the amount of extra killing capability that the program for the big gun and turret would provide was simply not worth the dollar cost. I thus would refer you to my Wither the Autoloader video and why I think that if you're going to install an autoloader, ditch the fourth man. Charles Charange, how many years do I see the Abrams still being in the US Army? I believe the current plan is to keep it in the inventory until at least 2050. The only thing I can think of which would not see it extended even further than that, honestly, is either a massive change in weapons technology or in fuel availability. Also, if I were given the position of Palmer but for the German Army, which projects would I have cancelled? And any I would have championed that were not made. For those who are not aware, he is referring to General Wilson Palmer, who headed up what has become known as the Palmer Board, or the Special Armored Vehicles Board. This was a rationalization exercise conducted by the US Army when it was felt that there were too many vehicles under development, wasting resources, dollars, and man-hours. The purpose of the board was to select one vehicle of each category for further work. So, the most promising tank destroyer, the most promising armored car, and the most promising light tank. Today, the way competitions tend to work is that there is a minimum baseline standard set by the Army. If multiple entrants for a requirement meet that standard, such as reliability, accuracy, fuel efficiency, weight, and so on, instead of taking necessarily the best of the two, they will take whichever of the two meets all the requirements but costs the least. After all, the list of requirements was put out in the initial tender, so that's what folks were aiming for, and in theory, that's what the Army felt best suited at the time. Practical case in point. For the M9 pistol competition, of the 8 pistols submitted, 2 passed trials, the SIG P26 and the Beretta 92. Beretta's bid was $75 million, SIG's was $78 million, so the M9 contract went to Beretta. There can be a little wiggle room for something which provides ridiculously good capability in excess of the standard for only a little more, but generally speaking the point stands, lowest bidder. However, back in the days of the Palmer board, cost wasn't so much the issue as much as capability. Even if it looked like 2 or more vehicles were likely to meet the requirements as set out by the Army, There can be only one. The job of the Palmer board was to determine which vehicle of the lot was most likely to be the most capable or successful project, allow that to continue, and end all the others. So, in fairness to the Germans, 3 points. Firstly, the Palmer board referred to new production types only. The Germans, starved as they were for vehicles, put many types into the field, but a lot were conversions of already extant vehicles, so were a case of resource efficiency anyway. Secondly, the Germans actually were quite willing to give up on a bad lot. Porsche Tiger, Panzer II, so on. Probably the big difference was that the Germans were willing to consider the combat zone to be a test agency and would send prototypes out there. As a result, because of the combinations of conversions, test vehicles, and new production models, model kit manufacturers have been blessed with a massive variety of vehicles to sell to the model making public. But still, the Germans knew when to cut their losses, such as with, say, Steyr Emil. They didn't make any more. Thirdly, they had significant manufacturing issues. Some of the factories were, quite simply, not capable of making preferred vehicles. So it was a case of they make something not quite as preferred or nothing at all. Now, if I were a German Palmer board in the US, for example, I would probably nix production of the Jagdpanzer IV, Jagdpanzer 38T, Jagdtiger and build nothing but Jagdpanthers as the general TD, because pretty much any of the factories would be capable of making them in the US. And if they couldn't, well, then the US would simply build a new factory to do it. The US did it at least twice. Such was not an option for Germany, however, so the idea of a Palmer board really doesn't cross over all that well in the first place. However, if I were to nix programs, the V1 and V2 would probably be first to go, as would most of those jet bomber concepts if there's any say in it. Focus on something practical for the short term, i.e. stopping the Allied advances. Jagdtiger would have gone away, as would Maus. In fact, don't let Porsche build any more tanks at all. Actually have them build trucks and the like. I personally think they'd be better off building Martyrs instead of the Jagdpanzer 38Ts, but obviously the Germans disagreed. Pick one truck type that works and make all the factories build the same thing, much as the plans for the Willys Jeep were handed over to Ford, or B-17s were built by Boeing, Douglas, Lockheed and Vega. Somehow I can't imagine a situation in Germany where Porsche would build a Henschel designed vehicle, no matter how much sense it would make. Now, in all fairness, the idea was not totally foreign to Germany. Look at the Einheits diesel truck, made to a standard design by 9 manufacturers. But that stopped production in 1940 as unsatisfactory, and it seems that they never revisited the idea. You'll note that I don't put King Tiger on the cancel list. It's because it's an offensive tank, and if the Germans were to ever try to bring the Allies to the negotiating table, it needed to do it after an offensive which showed the advantages of a negotiated peace. If you were orienting your entire force to be purely defensive and never attack, it's not a matter of if you will lose, but when. Colonel Chang. M41 and the Textron light tank, i.e. Stingray, have remained popular with Thai cavalry officers despite their advanced age. One of the most liked characteristics is the light weight, which allows it to cross pre-1990 era bridges rated to 27 tons. How common is it for local geography and infrastructure standards to influence tank designs? Almost always. Even if you're doing something stupid like Maus, there is an acceptance that the infrastructure won't hold the weight, so it's built to snorkel. And this goes back pretty much as far as you like. Railroad loading gauges were the big thing in the UK from day one, which is why the sponsons on the Mark IV could fold inwards. If it couldn't fit on the British loading gauge, which being the oldest in the world was also one of the smaller ones, the British wouldn't build it. And this attitude was held through until Centurion, when they finally decided to throw it in town and throw it out the window. The UK is not that big a country anyway for trucking purposes. American medium tanks were originally held to about 18 tons to accommodate for most of the bridges in the country that were pre-war. And of course, infrastructure in World War II also includes the ability to ship vehicles around the globe, which was a huge factor in US vehicle design. In the Cold War, the Bern loading gauge of Europe was considered the standard for which every tank mounted on a flat car had to fit, even from the US, as it was the expected area of operations. Israel's unique running gear for the current Merkava was a result of the rocky terrain of the Golan. The effect of the mountains for Korea and Japan I've already mentioned earlier, and in previous Q&As I've mentioned how the Chinese and Japanese still consider the lightweight of lighter armoured vehicles to be a necessity for operations in certain parts of their countries, and so on. So it's for this reason that Israel doesn't claim Merkava is the best tank in the world, but they do claim it's the best tank in the world for Israel. As I always say, each tank is designed under a unique set of circumstances which resulted in its creation, and for this reason, direct comparisons will never work well. Philip Gertler. In my talk on AFV development in World War II, I framed much of the discussion around the process from where ideas come from and how they make it to the final production line. Did the UK have a similar process in their tank development? Well, firstly, I will direct you to the Operation Think Tank Part 2, found elsewhere on my channel. Go to 530 and David Fletcher does a brief attack on the topic. Then I would direct you to the book The Business of Tanks by G. McLeod Ross. And he goes into it in a whole hell of a lot more detail in about 11 reasonably short chapters. According to him, the reason the British ballsed it up were as follows. Now bear in mind, he spent much of the war in the US buying tanks, so his perspective mainly only applies to the tanks used in the early war years before he went to America. In the book, he gives only sort of light addressing to the fixes to all of these problems made in the middle of the war. No technical cadre for tank development. Absence of an effective general staff specification. Absence of a suitable engine. Absence of an experimental workshop. Divorce of tank from gun, i.e. the guns were developed by artillery, the mechanical bits of the tank by wheels and mechanization, and some poor schmuck had to kind of merge the products of the two departments to make a tank. Speed being the determining factor in assessing a tank. Shelving of the few officers' experience in tank design and a consequent loss of continuity. The general staff lost its weapons advisors to the Ministry of Supply. The attempt to develop a tank by board, and failure of the general staff to contrive materiel supplies. So that is their answer. I'm now going to go on to a slightly more successful example of British production with the gun of the month. And this is the only bolt action I own. And I vastly prefer the modern stuff, but in my quest to get one of everything the Irish ever have, a number 4 Mark II Lee Enfield. There is a reputation going around that these blonde post-war productions were Irish contract. Not. This is a UF-55, which as near as I can gather was made for the RAF. Granted, 1955 or so. But it is one of the last ones made and it works fine. In fact, the thing is stupidly accurate. I was out one day at the range and the state marksmanship unit was setting up next to me and they set up metal targets at known distance. 600 yards I think was one of them, 600 or 800 yards, can't recall which. Set up a target, so okay, what the hell. So I pop up the distance sight, set it to 600 or 800, take a shot. About 3 seconds later, I hear pink from the hit. I hit it, yeah. Because I'm not going to get any better. I have to say, I'm hugely impressed. Kick like a mule, but hey, World War II rounds, well, that's the sort of thing you expect. Something I never understood, considering how easy the magazine is to detach. I see a pretty typical magazine. Why they kept with it being a top loader? You would have thought they would have moved it to magazine fit if it was all that much better, but questions I do not know. I have tried a mad minute with it. It's fun, it's expensive. I don't know if I hit much, but there really isn't much to be said about this rifle. It just does exactly what it's supposed to do. So there you go, another part of my Irish collection. Garrett, I find myself watching Operation Think Tank every few months on YouTube. Could there be the possibility of an event done by a Zoom or Discord? That's actually a fair question. I think I prefer the interaction which comes around in person, though. There was a proposal in place to tackle such a thing, but COVID nailed it for at least 2 years now, I think. Plus, I suspect a part of the reason that folks agreed to partake in the first one was that it was a free flight to a great tank museum in California and an excuse for drinking sessions with their colleagues who they rarely see, let alone all at once. Basically what happened was that Fletcher found a brew house near the hotel, and it's just like the meeting just relocated to have pints when they weren't in front of the camera. The whole event was not a cheap move by Wargaming, and probably why we've put off ever doing it again. Jordan Peterson. About 9 months ago, Spookston made a video on a thought experiment on the ultimate M4 Sherman, in which he made what he saw as the best Sherman using later war test projects and components. Although the tank would be impractical to produce and suffer reliability problems, what projects would you bring together in one tank? Or would you stick with what Armoured Branch ended up with, i.e. the E8? Well, after having a quick look at the video, the one major change I would make if possible is one that he seems to have missed. Now, I will discount his post-war modifications like a new turret, as Sherman was obsolescent, just build M46s instead. You wouldn't do a bodge of a new turret, be a country desperate for tanks like France or Israel. By and large, I would have kept with the A376 HVSS as actually done. I realize this is a little bit tautological. I mean, this is obviously the best decision because it was the one which was done. But bear in mind that what was done for a reason, and the decision makers back then had a lot more resources to make their decision than I do. And the only advantage I have is hindsight. So for example, we know now that the high-speed reverse transmission was reliable and approved, but this only happened, testing completed, when the war ended and production was about to stop. Simply because, as I say, it took that long to test it. And the US had a policy of not using the combat zone as a testing agency, and so not fielding anything until testing was completed. With hindsight, we know the gearbox worked. We wouldn't have been so sure about that in early 1944 though. So anyway, my two Sherman changes. 1, build HVAP earlier, easy increase in effective firepower. 2, put the torque converter automatic transmission in from the M18 into the tank. We know from fielding of M18 that it worked, and it worked well. Unfortunately, such a blindingly obvious idea was also blindingly obvious to the army in the 1940s, and they had the same thought. The problem was that all available production of the transmission was being sent to the M18, and there was nothing left over to go to the tanks until the end of the M18's production run near the end of the war in November 1944. The other solution would have been to build more transmission production capacity, but that also takes a bit of time and will bring us towards the end of the war. So yes, if you look at all the various components, varying from torsion bar suspension to inertial navigation, infrared systems to fire control computers, which were trialed and technically worked, the arguments against incorporating them in production, which were being made in 1944, are exactly the same as they are for this thought exercise. Kazuki K. Long months ahead, but at least we got vaccinations rolling. Looking forward to more museum visits. Indeed, I've had my first Moderna. Moderna number 2 will be at the very end of April or early May, and so we add 2 more weeks before I start looking at this. So hopefully by then, countries will have come to some form of arrangement for folks coming or going with vaccines at that point. If not, there are a couple of places I can go to in the US. Looking at the use of drones against armour in Nagorno-Karabakh recently, is it feasible to place a machine gun on the rear of the turret that can be crewed by supporting infantry riders in order to deal with the drone threat? I think you have an overly optimistic assessment as to how good people are with a pintle-mounted machine gun. The chances of hitting a drone with a 7.62 are pretty small. Even spotting it might be hard. You need something with a fire control computer. Besides, modern turrets should never stop traversing because of scanning for targets and threats, and it makes it difficult for a tank rider to aim the gun. So you're better off relying on purpose-built counter-UAS systems likely on escort vehicles, although it's possible perhaps that an active protection system may well be configurable to work against suicide drones as well. Question 2, it's traditional. Did I have or hear of any serious encounters with the turret monsters on my deployment, discounting the ammunition door incident? Outside of losing an MP3 player, which had been hooked to the intercom system and knocked down somehow, no, the tank generally behaved itself and didn't eat anything that it wasn't supposed to eat. What's the strangest thing I have seen from the locals during my deployments to Iraq or Afghanistan? One of Ian's anecdotes about Iraqis taking the protective caps off RPG warheads long before ever using them comes to mind. Animal husbandry, if you kind of go where I'm going. I don't think they realised just how good our night vision was. Or maybe they just didn't care, I don't know, we didn't ask. The standard react to contract drill for Iraqi forces at the time was what we referred to as the Iraqi death blossom. It didn't matter from where the incoming fire came, all the outgoing fire went all directions. Sim Crawford, can we get a video where you just ramble on about any old tank related crap I find interesting with no real theme, plan or narrative? I suspect that will be a good portion of my recent videos actually. Going from Belfast to the US autoloaders is a bit wider than my normal spread and comes from a lack of an ability to obtain new material. I was talking to a couple of other YouTubers. They had similar problems, generally running out of material on the shelves that had been recorded by June or July and were starting to scrape the barrel. Failing that, what's the most fun I've had in a tank, both in the army or videoing stuff? Just videoing? Probably running in the Remembrance Day convoy in Canada. No pressures like in the army, just good fun. Working in Sweden with Stefan, the director there, comes a very close second, complete with the drive of the S-tank to top it off. He just let me loose with my camera. I don't think he even warned me not to break anything. As to the army, it's actually kind of difficult for me to come up with anything specific. Yeah, sure, gunnery is fun. Who would think it wasn't? I think the exercise I really enjoyed the most was when I had just passed my driver's test for the Nissan Patrol and I did a full weekend behind the wheel in Wicklow. I was probably supposed to hand it off to another trooper who had just passed, but I didn't relinquish the wheel and nobody pushed the issue. Also, playing Op4 is always a whole lot of fun. And every now and then it's nice to take off the rank and fill in as a private for some squad level training event where the squad is short-handed. One of the dirty secrets about promotions is that the more you're promoted, the less fun you're allowed to have. You have to be all responsible and make weighted decisions and stuff instead. Right, that is it. End of Q&A number 19. This video probably is pre-recorded and I'm currently off in Fort Hood. Yay. And chances are the next one will be too, because this is a long exercise. So I hope you found it all interesting and informative. Good luck, and I will talk to you on the next one. Take care.